Thank you, Yujin. I think a big thanks to all our four presenters for keeping their time limits. So now may I invite the two discussants of paper one, Professor Liu Jian and Dr. Siddiq Wahid, to please come and share their thoughts with us. And quickly to invite Professor Liu Jian is Senior Professor at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, and Dr. Siddiq Wahid is a distinguished expert on India-China studies and also an adjunct fellow at the Institute of Chinese Studies based in Delhi.
Do you want me to go first? The first paper first, or?
The first paper, yes, please.
Okay. So that Dr. Uttamlal offered us a very interesting paper. And I know that in this area that Indian scholar Professor Madhavi Tampi with the Delhi University, she made some studies of this area, the cross-border trade between China and India. In China, scholars in the past have done some research work, but this area has been neglected for a long time. I have not come across any paper like this. The reason is apparent that you also mentioned that in your paper. Scholars in both countries find it hard to get access to the remote areas, border areas of the two countries. And in your paper that you point out a very important phenomenon. That is cross-border interaction, religious, culture, etc. Came to a standstill, came to almost a naught in middle 20th century. You also try to explore the reasons for this. I think that was you are right to mention that it was because that nation states were created at that time. And people in India and in China, in border areas, formed their notion of a country, then the border, the boundaries. Then this gave great restrictions, limitations to the cultural, religious, and economic activities that used to be very flourishing between the two countries. You mentioned three routes. In fact, there was another route that was from Assam via Burma to Yunnan. And in ancient times, in 2,000 years ago, in the first, second century BC, also Chinese who went to Afghanistan found that some Chinese goods sold there by Indians, and the Chinese goods were produced in Yunnan and Sichuan. They went through Burma to India, then all the way to Afghanistan. In fact, that this you also connected your research finally with all the problems with the relations of the two countries, and put forth your suggestions and your prospect of a solvement of the problems. That in addition to that trade routes, you mentioned that not only silk, but also many other important articles. We know that before 1949, the founding of the People's Republic of China, that Indian merchants, even moneylenders, came to Xinjiang. We could find these Indian people that are very active in the oases towns in southern and northern Xinjiang. Moneylenders, traders, a lot of them. And there was even Hindi hotels, especially opened for Indian traders. And some Indian traders even settled down in China and got married with local people. And also between Nepal and Tibet, there was also close economic connection in the past for more than 1,000 years. And there is an epic in Nepal, Muna Madan, that Muna Madan told us the story, the emotional connection and financial activities of Nepal traders in Tibet. It seems that they could make easy fortunes in Tibet. They worked there for several months, 6 months. Then they could earn sacks of gold, and they became rich when they returned their home. This, of course, stopped in the middle 20th centuries. I think that since historically the two countries were so closely connected in many aspects, not only in religion but also in trade, and we need to still further our studies. You have done a very excellent job. I think that it was not easy. You had conducted many interviews with different people. Therefore, I really like your paper and your work. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Liu Jian. May I invite Dr. Siddiq Wahid to present his comments, please?
Thank you. Thank you. I've sort of got three categories of reaction to it. One is an overall reaction. Then I think there are some sort of things in the paper itself that are very specific, which I won't go through here. Maybe we can sit down later on and talk about it. And then some suggestions from a theoretical point of view as to how you might want to look at the paper. First of all, it's a great title. I mean, I got very excited by, suturing fragmented geographies and fragmented land trade routes or land routes. I think sometimes the titles become very ambitious, and so then to sort of, make sure that you don't bite off more than you can chew, it becomes a very, very difficult problem. So I think that this is something that you need to take a look at. I think that there were some very good positive points that you made in the paper. One is that even provinces or states in the Indian context are not homogeneous. And I can say also that districts are not homogeneous, as you well know, I mean, coming from the area. So I think that and some of these overall suggestions you might want to pick up on and expand on vis-a-vis the paper. The other thing is that it's an exciting topic, borderlands, and I think that there is a need for injection of some sort of theoretical stuff on borderlands and the center, periphery, core discourse that you sort of initiate, and it needs to be expanded on. I think that you talk about lack of infrastructure and what that means, for the lack of trade, if you will, or whatever. I think you need to ask the question of why there is a lack of infrastructure a little more rigorously. And see where it goes. I think the most interesting part of your paper was suturing suggestions, the suggestions for how to suture. And I'll have a little more to say on that. And certainly, I think a lot more time needs to be spent on the paper, on that topic. Because I think that's the meat of it. What do we do, and where do we go from here? As I said, I mean, there are some issues regarding citations, expansion, some of which I mentioned, and some good thoughts on which need to be further honed and refined. And I think that that's something you should address. Theoretically, you make a statement that, Silk Route, again and again, I think, that the Silk Route is an umbrella term. And so forth. I mean, being an Eurasianist and a Eurasian sort of a person looking at Eurasian history, it's not an umbrella term. It's a very specific term, meaning a very specific thing. And that you need to pay attention to. I mean, I don't have a problem with if you want to theorize and sort of, defend the idea that it's an umbrella term and that it's not a very useful term. This has been done in scholarship before. But then it's a different paper altogether. And it won't work with a footnote, or it won't work with just a few paragraphs. I mean, it needs to be looked at very carefully. The other thing is that I think you need to address the issue of how the modernist state somehow makes a shift between, sort of concern for people versus concern for territory. All states are very territory specific. I mean, that's no question. Ever since they existed, they are. But the point is that as we come into modernity and the so-called postmodern period, I mean, territory seems to be acquiring more and more an important issue, and people less and less so. And what is it? I mean, I think that this speaks to a very core element of your paper. I think you need to make a distinction between referring to borderlands and to frontiers. Two different things altogether. And there's a lot of theoretical work on that. You need to address it, you need to push it, and I think it'll become a very important thing. Paper, because I think that it's a question of why is it when the borders are concerned that most establishments seem to address security issues, territorial security issues, and not people's security issues and people's issues. And that, I mean, I think that elliptically, or rather by inference, you mentioned it many times, but to pull it together as it's going to be important. Finally, suturing. I think your suturing suggestions, as I said earlier, were great. There were two categories. One was pilgrimage, Buddhist studies, medical, whatever, knowledge, I think, in the borderlands. And as you know, in the Himalaya, medical knowledge, I mean, I think there's an amazing wealth of it, all the way from Ladakh to the Northeast, and Arunachal. And how do we pull it together and stuff? And that's one aspect of it. The other one is you mentioned that suturing could be done through energy corridors and wilderness management and cryosphere stuff, if I may. These are two diametrically, I mean, not diametrically opposed, but two very, very different categories of people. I mean, for example, I would argue that energy corridors helping people in the region, I don't think so. It's states making a necessity, I mean, a virtue out of necessity, because, I mean, they can't. I mean, they're going through the land. So whether it's in Bangladesh or in Pakistan, it is to acquire things. And at the end of the day, in the core periphery discourse, it means that somehow it is for the periphery, I mean, it is for the core that you build a road, that you get energy, that you do everything. And in the meantime, people are waylaid by this. One example of it, for example, is in Gilgit-Baltistan area. Great development taking place. Is it? Or is it just that, it needs to get to the port? And so you need to build the Karakoram Road, you need to strengthen it. Similarly, in the Northeast, I'm less familiar with the Northeast of South Asia, but is it just that because it happens to be there? You have to build the road through it, and so therefore look east. I mean, was that supposed to mean? Maybe that's why it's not, hasn't picked up as much as the look east policy should pick up. All in all, a great paper, great topic, even more. I think that strengthening it is something, obviously, that you're in the process of. Be more than happy to help. So good, since we are on the same continent. Thank you.
Thank you, Siddiq. Thanks to both our discussants. I'd like to now invite the discussants for paper 2, Paula Banerjee and Sanjay Reddy. Let me quickly and briefly introduce both of them. Paula Banerjee is Associate Professor at the Department of South and Southeast Asian Studies at the University of Calcutta, and she's also visiting Fulbright scholar with the State University of New York. And Sanjay Reddy is Associate Professor of Economics at the New School for Social Research and also co-academic director of the ICI.
No one from Syracuse this time.
Paula, would you like to go first?
Sure, of course. Actually, what is most interesting about this paper is the way it's situated. And I think Nimi did a wonderful job of talking about it as flows. So this is a completely different kind of a flow that we are talking about. And after Uttam's paper, this micro-narrative, you come to this meta-narrative of English language and attitude to English language. What I find most interesting about the paper is actually its lack, and that is the comparison between India and China. And probably that should have been sort of the core of the paper. So I would really urge the author to sort of rethink the paper around this very, very interesting and important theme of why for Indians English language acquired this specific place, whereas for China it did not. And to begin that discourse, I think one of the other lacks in this paper is the discourse on colonialism. It's there, but still not there. And for a paper which is titled as Indian Attitude Towards English, I think one has to address the question of colonialism in a much more frontal sort of a way. And I think, I'm going to urge that the author looks towards that. There are a lot of very, very interesting ideas in this paper, ideas on symbols, on metaphors, and all of that. But because I have just 5 minutes, I'm going to give suggestions about things that are not there. So that should not detract us from the merit of this study, which is extremely ambitious, I would say. And that's why so much more difficult. So having taken that into consideration, I would say that, one of the first things that probably, it's a very classical way of looking at a paper, but I think it has its own value. And that is, when we were taught to write a paper, we were always asked that go through the literature and tell us what's new in it. And I think this is a question that would recur over and over again as to what is the value of this contention, because the question of English language is a much studied field within Indian history, within the genre of Indian history. And what makes it even more ambitious is this leap between the colonial period and then the so-called post-colonial period, or the period where maybe there is post-coloniality without much of a decolonization, whichever way you look at it. And so, in trying to do both, I think there has been certain lapses and lacks happening, which needs to be plugged in and looked into. One of the most important thing is the author starts by saying what the paper is not. And it is not about individual discourses on English language. Yet, everywhere I see people's attitude. Who are these people that we are addressing to? If it's not an individual discourse, what kind of a discourse is it? Is it a nationalist discourse? Is it a colonial discourse? Is it an institutional discourse? All of these discourses have their own histories that needs to be addressed. And suddenly, by throwing in Thomas Babington Macaulay's discussions on it, it makes it even more controversial, because if one is trying to push the colonial or the administrative discourse, one really needs to start with the Charter Acts. And there are a series of those acts, and I particularly remember the Charter Act of 1813, where there is this huge debate as to what kind of an education India should have. And if that discourse is privileged, then the problem is we shouldn't really call it the people's discourse at all, because very, very little of the people, as we know, was ever involved in it. I am not the greatest fan of the subaltern studies, but even I would urge the author to look at that discourse as well, because who are these people that we are talking about? Because I'm particularly sensitive to the term people because it presents this homogeneous identity. And as the previous presentation shows, there is no homogeneity in the kind of identities that we are talking about or the discourses we are talking about. And I particularly feel the lack of, certain factors like ethnicity, gender, etc., in much of these presentation. And the other thing, that I would like to talk about is, again, this leap between history and then the present period. It's very ambitious. If one can pull it off, it's fantastic. Or maybe it would be good to keep the history as a prologue and then talk about the present period, because there is a lot of studies theoretically done on attitudes, and one really needs to know about what sources the author has taken into consideration, because when I looked at the literature, it's largely an amalgamation of secondary literature, and particularly keeping in mind that the author is a student of, is a Ph.D. candidate. It would be really interesting to look at what kind of sources she would like to look into or she's looking into. And the other big lack that I thought would probably have sort of, supported her own thesis is the lack of popular culture in the present period. Because, if one looks at English language and its impact and Indian attitude towards English, one has to look at popular culture. I remember in 2007 in New York Times, there was this fantastic article into what, pencil sellers all over rural India were actually marketing their pencils in English language. Because, but I like the point that, that much of Indian languages, this whole process of hierarchization of Indian languages and its fight against that is something that has brought English language frontally. But that point has also been made before. So, I would urge the author as a finishing comment to say that, the meat of the presentation is actually its comparison with China. And there is very little of China that I found here. That it could have been done in a wonderful way at looking at, why colonialism the world over brings in this whole notion of languages. Because if you look at the Maghreb region or Africa or even Latin America, one sees the potency of language and colonialism and that dyad coming together. Whereas in other areas like Thailand, where there has been no frontal colonialism, even in China, one doesn't see so much of importance of a foreign language like English. And my last question is English really foreign to India? Thank you.
Thanks, Paula. Sanjay?
Thank you. Thanks, Nimi. I very much enjoyed reading the paper and listening to the presentation. Thank you, Suing. I should say I don't have special competence on this topic, and so I'm very glad to follow Professor Banerjee, who has said much of what should have been said, and with much more relevant expertise behind her remarks. That having been said, I'm happy to declaim about various topics if given an opportunity. I'm not sure why I was asked to speak on this, but having been asked, I'm happy to seek your indulgence. As Professor Banerjee had suggested, perhaps this paper should be thought of in some sense as a prolegomenon, a beginning. I think that the author has done a very good job of describing some of the relevant background considerations and literature. But as Professor Banerjee said, there's a lot that's been written on this subject from various angles, and it could be introduced more. And in some sense, what I really want to urge her to do is to take a more sociological view or historical sociological view, introduce political economy considerations of various kinds concerning why languages are adopted, rise to prominence, rise to a certain position in a society or indeed in the world as a whole, and to make that much more a part of her account, whereas currently it seems to be much more about, in some sense, elite discourse concerning language adoption or use, with some attention to some of the ambivalences and tensions which are involved there, including the psychological and political aspects thereof. But she does, of course, point to some relevant literature which would lead in the sociological direction, for instance, in her reference to Braj Khatru's work on English and its different roles in the world, its three worlds, in fact. I want to suggest a few disparate thoughts which may be relevant as you develop this work. One of them is that I think that it may be interesting and useful for you to think about languages, foreign languages, so-called foreign languages in general and not just English. Because certainly in the Chinese case, it would seem that the idea of English as the preeminent foreign language to be learned is fairly recent, as it is in much of the world, even if it has been the case for a long time. It wasn't the case in the early or mid-19th century that it was a foregone conclusion that English would be the preeminent language. Certainly we know that the Chinese people considered it a great insult, correctly, that the European colonial powers were seeking to divide up China, and there were different concessions which existed and so forth. So the question of, and indeed the Japanese among them, so the question of what allows a particular foreign language to rise to dominance within a country or indeed globally is an interesting one, from a broad sociological point of view. You may be aware that in Africa, currently, there are some moves among the countries which had the misfortune to be colonized by countries other than Britain to overthrow their existing colonial linguistic inheritance in favor of English. You know, Mozambique went so far as to join the Commonwealth quite recently as a way of doing this. And of course, there were riots in Cote d'Ivoire, you may be aware of, where people were in the south, the activists there were carrying around American flags and demanding that English be taught rather than French in the schools and so forth. Not British flags, of course, American flags, because that's the relevant form that the English language appears today to people. This is as good a point at any, as I suppose, to mention the famous linguistic slogan, which I believe is of uncertain origin, that a language is a dialect with an army and a navy. So the idea that India is a country with many languages, but China has one language, has to be viewed in this light. That it is not entirely obvious why we view China as having one language and India as having many languages. And I think if we want to think about that, we have to think in terms of the state-centric civilizational perspective in China as a subjective experience, and the way in which that conditions Chinese tendencies to think of these entities we could consider different languages as different dialects, perhaps. But I'm no expert on this. Other people are really verging into territory which I'm completely, I'm really an improper interlocutor in. Let me also say in that connection that I think it's important for you to be aware of and investigate more deeply as you develop this, the gradient, sociological gradient of English language competence in India. And how in other words, the question of who, well, first of all, the awareness that different people have different levels of English language competence that has differential histories behind it. It has ongoing social and political content and implications, valences. There are certain groups which had a head start in some sense in the acquisition of English, and this is all important to understanding contemporary dominance hierarchies in India. And of course, the relationship between the English language and the state, as well as commerce, not only in its current globalized moment, but earlier, has to be apprehended. Of course, this is not true only in India, it's true in many parts of the world. And I think if you went into the history of who learned English first in China, you might well find that something similar has to be understood and described. What is the role of Christianity in that? And other such relevant historical phenomena. I think that you have to look at this in terms of contemporary political discourse on caste and class. The English language acquisition, the aspiration for English language acquisition plays a very important role, as well as the question, as you note, of English as a more liberatory language in some sense. So please bring in more of that kind of portraiture. I think it would help a great deal. the lack of a cultural revolution or anything like it in India to bring about some disruption of these hierarchies is sometimes talked about by Indians, especially those on the left. And I think that would be interesting to inquire into, whether that has any implications. We often think about English as only being an advantage, the existence of very large numbers of people who speak English. But it is also a disadvantage from the point of view of what used to be called quaintly in Indian state-centric discourse, national integration. But even as a historian and sociologist such as Ernest Gellner pointed out rather simplistically, but nevertheless relevantly, in terms of the everyday work of nation-state activity or functioning, that having a unitary language is tremendously useful in terms of certain kinds of coordination. To the extent this can be a language which is truly adopted by the mass of the people, this has certain functional advantages. I think China shows that in certain ways. And there's a reason that China chose one of those dialects/languages and propagated it. India has attempted to do the same, arguably less successfully, but still successfully. And that's a sense in which India today is or even China today are different in a different position than they were 50 or 60 years ago, or 100 years ago, in terms of this Gellnerian activity of nation-state construction, which we may not all like, those of us who wish to celebrate margins and diversities of various kinds, but it remains a fact that, as was pointed out in the last panel, this has a certain kind of attractiveness from the point of view of the state. So I suspect I have gone on already much too long. One sentence, though, I might like to add if I have half a minute, because Ashok asked me also to comment on Min's presentation, next one. Shall I wait? But I just want to add 1 minute on that, or half a minute, so maybe it's easier for me to do it here, rather than, because I don't want to take up time from the other people, which is... Oh, there's only one other person. All right, then I'll wait. Okay, thank you. Right.
Thank you. Thank you, Sanjay and Paula. There's a slight change in the schedule. One of our discussants is unable to join us, Chin Kao, because she's unwell. So both Sanjay and Professor Sanjay and Professor Jian have graciously agreed to step in at the last minute to provide additional comments. So Vamsi would give the detailed comments, and Sanjay and Professor Tsoi will give additional comments. Grateful to all three of you. And let me quickly introduce Vamsi Vakulabharnam, Associate Professor of Economics at the University of Hyderabad and visiting scholar at the ICI. Vamsi.
Should I start?
Yeah, please.
Okay. Thank you, Nimmi. So I have a few comments that are that I hope are useful to you. So the first, broad comment is that it's. I think it's an interesting contrast between India and China. On the whole, I thought it was also accurate. In fact, going back to an anecdote, from the mid-90s when I was doing grad school in Amherst, Massachusetts. A Chinese group came, and they were talking to the grad students. And they saw me and they asked me, well, the diaspora in China, the Chinese diaspora has done a lot for our development. What has your diaspora done? And I had very little to say at that point in time. I was a little taken aback by that question. And I think, if one imagines that, let's say these two large countries did not have any substantial diasporas, the Chinese path of development might have been very different, whereas the Indian path, in my intuition, would not have been so different, probably, right? So in that sense, what you are capturing in your paper is somewhat accurate. But we can, discuss that further. But this is, while it's an accurate view, as I said, anecdotally earlier, it's also a known view. that, the Chinese diaspora had a much stronger role to play in the overall development of China. So here I have a few critical points, about the overall paper. I don't know if you are asked to work on FDI, but, your title basically said, diasporic impact on the diffusion of capitalism in these two countries. So if you had not focused entirely on FDI, you might have actually looked at other phenomena that are of interest, especially in the Indian case. So a broad sort of theoretical critique of the paper is, I think the entire argument is made from a supply side kind of a model, right? Not demand side, but supply side kind of model. And there are many routes to generating capital in a supply side model, but they would be mostly, how savings are generated either domestically or, outside the country. And the other aspect of the supply side model is, how technology comes in or how knowledge is built, these kinds of things. And I think in this broad context, the analysis of the importance of the Chinese diaspora in supplying ideas or influencing policy or supplying technology as well as capital, ideas and resources as you call it, I think it's convincing, on the whole, at least for me who is an outsider, who has only read secondary literature. However, in the Indian case, barring the software industry, you argue that, it's the diasporic influence is mainly in terms of ideas and the people who actually returned from the US, who took up important positions in the government or the planning commission and so forth. But given the supply side model that you adopt, certain things become not so visible to you. So for instance, if you looked at the very recent World Bank report on remittances, for instance, in the last couple of days, it's all over the news. India continues to be the highest, the destination for the highest amount of remittances, and last year they got something like $70 billion. Right? China is second. I mean, China also is not insignificant. It got $65 billion. But over the last 20-25 years, India has been almost consistently topping, the remittance destination. So why is this important? If you actually adopt a demand-side model, right, there has been a very significant demand-side influence of remittances on overall economic development. Okay, so it's not just FDI. I mean, if you technically take FDI, you can't count remittances as part of FDI. But these are, this is money that's flowing into the country. And if you take, let me just give you two examples, right? The state where I come from, Andhra Pradesh, which may not last too long. It may split into two states. But the other state, about which I know a little is Kerala, right? So if you look at these two states and look at the impact of remittances, there's a substantial impact. You can look at, agricultural investments, for instance, right? A lot of investments have gone into agriculture. And you look at something like construction or real estate, Kerala is actually a booming economy right now. If you look at the last 20 years, the old Kerala model is passé. The low growth, high human development kind of a model is passé now. It's a very high growth model right now. And where is this high growth impetus coming from? It's primarily through remittances that Kerala receives, from not very professional migrants, but actually low wage migrants in the Middle East and so forth. Right? You focus entirely on the professional diaspora, but this has come back and altered very significantly, these two economies. And the remittances have altered the growth rates in these economies. They've changed the class structures in these economies. They've affected the inequality levels. In many cases, heightened the inequality levels in these economies. Right? So in a broad sense, focusing just on FDI may not give you an accurate picture on what's going on in the Indian case if you want to estimate the diasporic impact. Okay, so that's, and A broader comment on your model. I think even if you do a supply side model, I think your analytical structure may be a little too broad or a little too loosely structured, so that we do not know exactly what role these diasporas are playing in India and China. We have that that diagram you drew, which is somewhat broad. But what are the exact mechanisms? Can you actually provide good sources? In the Chinese case, I did see, that there was some rigorous work about the late 70s and 80s. But in the Indian case, it's not so clear. It's too broad. So, can you provide some data or some sources to make a rigorous set of comments on how diasporas actually influence the overall development of capitalism, as you call it. And the last point is, it's a general point about the tone of the paper. It almost seems that, you've uncritically accepted that, the liberal economic model is desirable, and, diasporas are actually feeding into a development of, that sort of a model, and this is generally good for these two countries. I would, I don't want to assume that. I think, it's good to take a critical or reflexive kind of position on this, especially after the global crisis of 2008, when these two countries are now, they have to focus much more domestically, cut down inequalities, build up domestic demand. So, a sort of an acceptance of external trade liberalization or, liberalization of FDI is not necessarily the route that these two countries have to take in the coming decade or two. So, in that sense, maybe a little bit of critique of or self-consciousness of the position you are taking might be helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Vamsi. May I invite Professor Jian to give his comments, please? Or would you,
No. I prefer you go first, if you don't mind.
Let me quickly introduce Professor Jian is professor at the School of Public Policy and Management at the Tsinghua University, and also visiting visiting scholar at the ICI.
Thank you. It's my great pleasure to be here. And but actually, I lack the expertise to comment on this paper. Especially, Ashok only asked me this morning as a replacement for another discussant who couldn't come this morning. But after listening Professor Ye's talk, I also, like Vamsi, found this a very interesting and stimulating paper. I mean, I agree with Vamsi. I mean, I think you identify an interesting and valid pattern. And I have not much add to what Vamsi's excellent comments on this importance of remittance. And I think, for example, if you using Vamsi's terminology of supplies, if you still mainly focus on the supply side. So another recent example to support your argument may be this high-profile return of the central bank governor, Reddy, from the University of Chicago back to India to become the central bank governor. Most recent phenomenon, very controversial, and about this. I wonder this national holiday, whether or not maybe you have touched on in your paper. I haven't seen your paper. May play a role, and otherwise, I would also encourage you to be more specific on the mechanisms of diaspora's influence. And maybe one example of this mechanism in connection with Vamsi's request of you to be being more self-conscious and critical about this new liberal project. Actually, I think the diaspora has a different influence in different regions regarding the labor politics, like strength of trade union. This may lead to our next discussion. For example, like in Guangdong area and the Zhejiang area, the trade union's power are different, I think. And this partly has to do with the diaspora, especially Hong Kong capitalist played in these two different regions. And as you may have aware, recently since you mentioned Shenzhen, so Shenzhen has recently had the third time reading of the revision of the labor contract law. But has not been passed by legislation, but the third time reading of labor contract law, which basically the difference between earlier versions of the labor contract law is that if the workers asked for collective bargaining, the enterprises must agree. But that's the new version. And the previous version is that when workers ask, they say the enterprise should agree the negotiation. But in fact, they may or may not. They only say should agree to the negotiation. But this new version says they must agree. But this has not been passed because there are strong oppositions from capitalists in Hong Kong, and they even go to the National People's Congress trying to stop this. But they are influencing, relatively speaking, in Zhejiang is somewhat different. But anyway, so this is just a kind of example of more, maybe looking for more concrete mechanisms of the diaspora's influence. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Professor Tsoi. Sanjay, may I request you?
Thank you. Let me just very briefly, thank you for the paper. I wanted to say that in line with both of the previous commentators, I think that it may be easy to exaggerate the role of diasporas in certain respects. For instance, take the role in policymaking. You had the very interesting table showing all of the World Bank alumni in policymaking positions. One could produce such a table for almost any country in the world right now, many countries at any rate. And for that matter, you can look at the senior intellectuals in the communist movements in India and find that a good number of them graduated from British or American universities. So it's not immediately obvious, what is it that, what is the relation between education, even having had a job in the World Bank, though that's a lot clearer, I should say, and having certain perspectives. I think if you want to ask the question, what role did foreign education play or exposure to certain ideas? I think in the Indian case you would find it did not play a decisive role so much as it played a legitimating role. It's helpful to be able to say Montek Singh Ahluwalia is an expert technocrat who brings his vast years of international experience in the World Bank and IMF with him, or Raghuram Rajan is such a person. By the way, for the record, Montek Singh Ahluwalia does not have a Ph.D., which you do say in your paper. He has an MPhil from Oxford. Not that it matters, I couldn't care less, but some people seem to think it matters. So you might want to make that clear. So it became useful at a certain stage to be able to say that we have the best technocrats of this sort rather than of that sort. But if you look at the pre-1991 policymaking circles, you will find that the table doesn't look so different, though their perspectives were very different. And therefore, some other explanatory factors have to be added to understand why there was a switch from one set of policy orientations to another. Similarly, with respect to the role of diaspora in investment, I think this is much more tricky. Your table is very interesting about the sharp reduction in the percentage of FDI associated with NRIs or the diaspora. It would be interesting to see the level as well as the percentage, because at the same time you have a big increase in the overall level. So did the level also fall from non-resident Indians, or was it just the percentage that fell so precipitously? I assume it's also the level, because you're showing a stark reduction. I find it hard to believe that it's only 1% now. I wonder what kind of measurement problems may be present there, but supposing that it's true, it's certainly a very stark figure. At the same time, there's an intangible role that intermediaries play who have international exposure. If you know the high-tech industries in Hyderabad, Bangalore, and so on, which you mentioned, especially in the middle and upper tier of these industries, you have a lot of circulating labor of a high-end variety. People with engineering qualifications who go between Silicon Valley and Bangalore, Hyderabad. And those people are very important to structuring the industry. They may be small in number, but without them, it wouldn't work in the way it does as a globalized sector. So I think there's a to use neoclassical economics of recent vintage, there's an O-ring production function problem you have here, which is that this one input might be very tiny, might look tiny, but it might be essential. The O-ring, you might remember, was the little what was it made of? It wasn't rubber, it was something else. But anyway, it was the little component of the Space Shuttle Challenger, which was flawed. It was discovered later on when the Space Shuttle Challenger blew up that the reason was this tiny little O-ring, which blew out. And the O-ring, the cost of that O-ring relative to the Space Shuttle Challenger was minuscule. It was incredibly small. But it turned out that imperfection led to the whole thing blowing up. So, similarly, you might say that there are certain kinds of interactions which are very crucial, even though it might seem that they're not significant. This is on your side, but I think that there's a little... Is it in the paper? I'm sorry, again, I was asked to read it. I wasn't even asked to read it. I was given it at the very moment this seminar began this morning. So I've only heard your presentation, so my apologies about that. But thank you very much. Then I fully agree with you. Thank you.
She talks about software sector as similar.
Thank you. Thanks to all three discussants. May I request Sanjay and Vamsi and Professor Soy to stay back to give their comments on the fourth paper, please. Thank you, Sanjay. Okay.
Should I?
Yeah, please.
Okay. So the paper of Jian on institutions, labor mobility institutions, and impact on FDI. I think the broad call that the paper makes is very valuable, because what you are saying is political factors are very important, and they have to be analyzed in conjunction with economic factors, and don't just focus on the macro political factors like democracy versus authoritarian rule or autocracy, but actually get into the mechanisms, the micro level institutions, and then see how the macro level dynamics play out. And I think that's a very healthy kind of call. And specifically, the puzzle that you seem to set up is that China and India are so similar in 1978. In fact, India may be a little ahead in terms of urbanization. But right now, they have very different levels and nature of FDI. And China gets a lot more FDI, which is also vertically integrated. That's the distinction you make, whereas India gets a lot less, but which is also horizontally integrated. So why is it that this sort of a divergence happens, right, over the last 30 or 30 plus 35 years? And you focus on the phenomenon of labor mobility, defined both as occupational mobility, that is mobility across jobs, and mobility, spatial mobility, which is you take rural-urban mobility as the proxy for spatial mobility, right? So that would be the. And you look at three institutions. One is the traditional institutions, as you call them, caste and hukou. Caste in India, hukou in China, which are actually mobility impeding, both of them. But then you look at two other institutions, which are labor institutions and land institutions. And the general argument seems to be that China has more flexible labor and land institutions compared to India. So that's where the puzzle, that's how the puzzle is explained, because China has more flexible institutions compared to the Indian institutions. So I have a number of problems with your argument. Okay, so the first, the first thing is, I'm not convinced that you are using very good data. This is serious because, for instance, your table 2, you show that China has a total of 58 million workers in manufacturing and India has 52 million workers. And this just cannot be right. I mean, because I don't know where you took that data from. Maybe it's from the yearbook. But it's just, nobody is going to believe those numbers, in the sense that, and based on that, you show that 37% of the workers in China are in the informal sector, right? But then we all know that there are at least 150 to 200 million, at least, migrants who have moved to urban spaces in China, right? I mean, if you are showing 58 million workers in manufacturing, where are all these migrants? So you need to actually answer that. I don't think that table captures the accurate data. And I have seen other studies based on chip data, for instance. Chinese household income project, the surveys that are conducted, and they show that at least about 60% of the workforce in urban spaces is informal in China, whereas you show 37%. So the broader point I'm hinting at is, I think you are exaggerating the differences between India and China. I think China also has a huge informal sector, may not be as large as the Indian informal sector, but they're more comparable than not. Okay, so that's the first point about data. The second point is, when it comes to labor institutions, you have taken the Besley-Burgess argument about how different Indian states have implemented labor legislation very differently, and therefore the ones which are because it's a concurrent subject. Labor legislation is both central as well as state, and those states which have become more flexible have been able to attract more investment. That's their argument, and this has been contested left, right, and center. Besley-Burgess argument is not a sacred argument anymore. People have attacked it, and people have shown that it's actually not very convincing in the Indian context. So why is it not convincing? Because on paper, it's true that India has a lot more labor legislation, but the actual implementation, right, in different states is very lax. And I know this, I also got involved in some labor disputes. The implementation is extremely lax. And this is, as you show, 93% of Indian workers are in the informal sector, right? So the labor legislation doesn't even apply. All the Industrial Disputes Act and other acts don't even apply to these workers. So the Besley-Burgess argument doesn't work really. So they may show it econometrically, but there may be other mechanisms for the results they are getting. And you talk about special economic zones where labor legislation is suspended completely in India, but show the employment. In case the flexible labor legislation is actually useful, where are the numbers in terms of employment in the special economic zones? So once again, I think on paper India may have more rigid labor institutions, but in reality, right, they're a lot more flexible than you have projected in the paper. So again, the difference is exaggerated between China and India. The third point is, again, when it comes to land regulation and the better compensation structures for the Indians, as opposed to the Chinese, where the state, can claim land, much more easily. If you take out the cases that became extremely big in the media, like Singur and Nandigram in Bengal, and a few other identified cases across the rest of the country, most of the special economic zones that have been created, have been done through a process where land has been acquired with relative ease, right, in the Indian situation. Once again, the broad point is that you are exaggerating the difference, looking at what is on paper between the Chinese and Indian cases. So if that is the main critique, then you don't have an answer to your puzzle, right? So that the differences are vastly exaggerated in the paper than they actually are. Then what is your main critique? Main answer to the puzzle? The answer doesn't remain as you pose it in your paper. So my guess is, and you can probably work on it as a hypothesis, I think, the Chinese model and the Indian model, right, as they began to experiment with it from the 1980s onwards, were very different from the beginning. I think Chinese, although 80s and 90s are very different in China, I think the commonality is, China was using, labor-intensive strategies from the very beginning, right? If you take township and village enterprises, that kind of an experiment in the 80s, it was focused on labor-intensive manufacturing. India never did that, right? India always focused on capital-intensive kind of manufacturing. So I think the differences in labor mobility are a consequence of the models that they adopted and not the other way around. So I would argue that, the causal structures in your case may have to be inverted, right? But, do think about it. And I was also left wondering, this is my last point, I was also wondering after reading your paper, what the real end of development is, right? Because in a way you are promoting, flexible labor institutions, where workers don't get good wages or they don't have security, they don't have other benefits, or, peasants, who don't have enough protection. Your paper almost celebrates that. This is how China reaches its development. I mean, I read your paper, so this is the sense I got. But that's not the real end of development. If you really want to focus on these two countries and look at development of the majorities in these two countries, then, how do they achieve better well-being? By being given security, by being given better wages, by being provided better incomes. So somewhere, while these institutions may work to get FDI or, to achieve higher growth, there's something perverse about the way these institutions have been transformed, right? So let me stop. Thank you.
Thank you, Vamsi. Professor Tsai.
Okay, so I always happy to be speaking after Vamsi because he's.
I asked you to go first.
No, because he's so smart and it makes my job easier. Basically, I think, but really, I like the spirit of this paper. I think partly may reflect your early training at the UCSD, right, University of California, San Diego. And so did you work with Susan Shirk? Yes. Yeah. I mean, as many of you may know that like Susan Shirk wrote a very interesting book, Political Logic of Economic Reform in China. So I think your work continues this perspective, emphasizing the political logic, underlying the economic policy choices, but I think similar to Vamsi, but I put it in a different way. Is that how to set up your puzzle? So your puzzle is from a Heckscher-Ohlin model of comparative advantage, and that's you set up your model. But in the recent development in the trade theory, actually, this model has been, I think, challenged or surpassed, I think importantly by this new idea, so-called intra-product division of labor, because Heckscher-Ohlin model based on the inter-product division of labor based on the comparative advantage. Each country is specialized in one product based on their comparative advantage. Another country specialized in another product based on their comparative advantage. But the new development, especially since the 1990s, based on the new practice in the world, is that the intra-product division of labor, and all related to global supply chain model. So I think if we agree with Vamsi's comments that you maybe overemphasize the difference between India and China, and in the labor law implementation, actually the India and China are not that different. But if then maybe you can recast your puzzle and maybe asking from this intra-product division of labor and global supply chain perspective, there may or may not be still differences in the patterns of foreign direct investment in China and India. Okay, I think that's all I want to say.
Thank you, Professor Soy and Vamsi. I think we have about 20 minutes or so for Q&A. The floor is open.
No, that will take all of them.
In the interest of feedback, Ashok suggests that we open the floor and get comments. Yeah, please.
I'll ask about something I think Vamsi was alluding to.
Tansen, I'm sorry. Could you please come over here? They're recording.
No, I don't want my face to be on the. I'm asking a sensitive question. The use of both the words diffusion and diaspora are problematic. I think I didn't read through your paper, but I saw glimpses of it. I think you do mention diffusion, but diaspora itself is a problematic term. And I don't know how you are placing Hong Kong, Macau, and Taiwan. Are they part of China or part of diaspora by the state? And how does the figure change if you remove Macau, Hong Kong, and Taiwan from the data? Does it make a difference? And diaspora is perhaps for sociologists and for historians, it's a long-term people staying abroad, perhaps second generation, third generation included. And the difference between those who go and study abroad and come back, that's a different category. Some South Korean went abroad and came back. You didn't put him up on the chart. I think many of the Chinese leaders went to Russia and came back. So how do you differentiate that? Wouldn't that show up in your data that diaspora is different in different parts of the world? And among diaspora, there are different categories. I think it was also mentioned that there is an elite class, there is a working class, Middle Eastern workers from India. And same for Chinese going to Burma and to Southeast Asia. There's this lower level category of people, also part of diaspora. So I think it would be good to clarify, if you haven't clarified it in your paper or your book, which diasporic component are you talking about? And you separate it from people who just go abroad to study and come back. So Highway, for example, in China, are you also talking about these people who are coming back So I think you should problematize this word diaspora, or perhaps not use it at all. And so I don't know how you have dealt with it in your paper or your book.
Would you like to quickly respond?
Just go to a microphone.
I dealt with it because that was my whole book, different kinds of diasporas and the impact. And this article is transitioned to the next one, so I really appreciate all the comments. And the concept I use is more like a transnational diasporas. It's more recent than the sociologist, and correctly, it's not the conventional sociologist usage of diasporas. So I include Hong Kong in the 1980s, but not after 1997. And some of you may have the same puzzle. That is, if we take out Hong Kong, Macau for China's FDI data, the number will be dropped by at least 50% to 70%. And that's my main point. With most economists, IPE defines China FDI as FDI, but most of them are from Hong Kong and Macau and Taiwan as well, and also the entry point. Those came earlier than the later. So they drive policy reforms. So, to conclude, I really appreciate these highlights, and I will definitely include them. But a lot of the thinkings are in the article, but also in the book.
I just just because Tansen had raised this point. I would still think, though, that it's very important for you to look at this Indian diaspora issue slightly more closely, because there is an area of diasporic activity which is genuinely old-fashioned sociologically well-defined diasporic activity, which is very important to the Indian economy. It tends to be informal, it is long-term, it is sustained, and it involves itself in extremely important informal monetary flows. Now, that operates in the West Asian region as well as in the South Asian region, and it is extremely poorly defined. This area is something which we don't discuss beyond a certain point. It has always been on the margins of data collection. Increasingly, it is attracting a degree of attention. It certainly exists as a very, very powerful means of moving money across the world. I think, in fact, since you're interested in diaspora, the fact that there is a link between the transnational of the present which you're dealing with and something which is more historic but persistent is something that perhaps in the Indian case you could bear in mind, because it will help you compare the Chinese as well as the Indian cases more effectively. Because there is something long-term in both which actually can be compared seriously. And the way in which it has changed and the way in which it is mapped is something that we should take into consideration.
Okay, a quick, just to the presenters, could I request the presenters, all the paper presenters, to quickly note the responses, because we're really running out of time, and so Ashok has alerted me that there could be more by way of feedback for you. So could I ask if, yeah, please.
Yeah, I have some questions and comments for all the papers actually, and I don't know. Maybe I can start with media, since there has been discussion on this already. My question to you is, I want to push the political argument that you have in the paper, and of course I haven't read it, so maybe you explain this in more detail there. But you did mention that there is a difference as to how FDI flows are affected by a political regime, and that there is a difference between a democratic versus authoritarian government. And of course we can push a lot as to whether India is really a democratic government, but the point here nevertheless is a little counterintuitive, if you want, because if you look at, for example, FDI investments in Korea in the 60s and 70s, you can definitely say that this was not a democratic government, and it was precisely because it had an authoritarian regime that it worked. So maybe develop this, and perhaps because you say that you come from political science, that would be very interesting to develop. My question for you, Jian, is how are these different labor laws or labor regimes and policies affecting domestic versus foreign companies? So is it the same? Is it different? To what extent today you can say that in India or China, foreign companies, because they are pressured by international agreements, really doesn't matter that much what the legislation of China or India is. My question for the first paper for Professor Lau is, are your suggestions something that the local people want, or is this are these suggestions from the core for the periphery as how the periphery should be developed? Is there any conversation between or suggestions among the people as how any improvements need to be made, and to what extent they align with what you're offering? And my last comments are actually comments, not questions, pursuing. I very much agree with everything that Professor Banerjee suggested to you, and I'm wondering whether it's possible for you to ground your paper in some specific moments of rupture, just like she suggested, in some specific discourses as to whether English or another language needs to take any type of dominance in India or China. And for the Chinese case, for example, you can look at the Boxer indemnities that sent a lot of Chinese students to the United States to study English. So what was their influence on the discourse of how English is developing in the country? Or maybe you can ground your discourse in something completely different. What about Hong Kong and Taiwan? What is the acceptance of English there versus the acceptance of English into China, which is such a vast place, it's very difficult to have a common denominator. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Paula?
Yeah, one comment. I mean, whenever one shows a graph or something, I think it's a good idea to source it. Because sometimes, during the PowerPoints, particularly the fourth PowerPoint, I didn't see a lot of sources. And I think Vamsi's comment is very essential here, that good sources always make good presentations of papers.
What's a good source?
Well, acceptable source, that is in the public domain.
Any other questions? Yeah, please.
I have a question to Jian. And I'm making some research on Chinese nationality system recently. My question is, do you think Chinese nationality system is a barrier of the diffusion to China?
I'm sorry, we don't. Yeah, please, I'm sorry, we may not have.
Talk later.
Yes, yes.
I apologize. Then we'll talk at lunch.
Yeah, at this stage, we may not be able to get all responses from the presenters, but yes, go ahead, Prakash.
My question is to you. Speak loudly for everybody. I wanted to ask you about the wage differential argument, and you said that if the wage differentials are high, the labor mobility is likely to be low. And this is kind of counterintuitive. Are you talking about some kind of threshold effects because the differentials are too high and they are attached to some kind of professional barriers that people from lower wage categories cannot set for or something like that? Because otherwise, I would like to move into a high wage labor category.
If there are no more questions, then maybe we could give a minute or two to the presenters to respond. Any more questions? No? We're done? Okay.
Okay, I have a...
Could I request you to come here and...
Thanks for all the great questions and the comments from Professor Tree and Vamsi, and I think there are very effective criticisms. I do think it's, but I think the one thing I want to just clarify, about your last point about, whether I was really celebrate, this Chinese model. Well, absolutely not. I don't really think this is, the one of the better model to, which other developing countries should follow. But I was just to point out they do have this kind of a different path, which needs to look at from not just simply democracy, autocracy perspective, but we have to look at all those micro mechanisms. And speaking about this data problem, I do have a hard time to really compare those kind of data collected from China and India, simply because they do have a different statistical system, and also the base of their data point is actually very different. So I think certainly there's a room to improve this data. But I can comment on the more specific question about this table on this employment, informal and formal employment, and also your comments about those institutions in book and institutions in practice. I agree that it certainly was probably Indian implementation of the labor and the land institutions may be more flexible than it was in paper, but so was China. So which actually do have this kind of labor laws and land regulations that's being put on paper, but the local governments has really followed those the regulations. And I have the the response to, I'm sorry, that lady about the labor regulations, whether they are different in China and India. Yes, in China, for the from the 1980s to the late 1990s, there was a difference between, the foreign firms and the domestic or state-owned enterprises. They do have actually followed the different labor regulations, because there is a specific, regulations for the foreign firms, which would actually give them more flexibility in hiring and firing. On the Indian side, at least on paper, there's actually no, they using the same, labor regulations at the federal level, but local governments do have the different kind of, practice. So another last points, Professor Tree's, point about, maybe I should just reframe this, the hypothesis from the global chain perspective. Yes, I think this is actually just very insightful, suggestion. I think as I follow this model, which is you consider as more, a classical, but maybe it's outdated model, simply because we were just trying to make it kind of like this comparison is more like doesn't really reflecting this the classical prediction, but your comments on the the new global chain perspective is very important. And lastly, about Prakash's comments on the why the wage difference, what's the relationship between the wage difference and labor mobility? Well, I think this is the assumption is if you have a there's no restriction on the labor mobility. Workers will have the incentive to move from a low-paid job to the high-paid job, and eventually you will see actually there's no difference across different industries because that would be formed equilibrium. So if you see there's wage differences, the assumption is there are some barriers between this, the regulations actually constrain those laborers from moving from one job, one low-paid jobs to a high-paid job. So that's actually those kind of assumptions. So we can use is the higher the wage difference across industries and the lower labor mobility. The occupational labor mobility. Okay, I will just be brief and thank you.
Would you like to respond quickly?
We'll be really brief. You sure that
yes,
to come out?
there is a request from.
I just want to thank all the commentators and question from the audience. And this is an ongoing project. My earlier book will be out in the summer, and this is leading to the next one. But at BU, I'm also starting a new course on Asian immigration and development. So if you have any material, like particularly on India and a classic work on this immigration diaspora, and please just send to me, and I'll be really happy to incorporate in the teaching materials, and also try to synthesize this into a bigger project. And many thanks, and I would love to carry on the conversations during the lunch break, receptions, and following this workshop. Thank you so much.
Uttam, would you like to respond?
Well, regarding question about the suggestions which I made in my paper, well, some of the suggestions are basically from the perspective of periphery, the people in the marginal areas that they want, particularly they want greater interactions for cross-border trade. They want easier border or rather softer border for tourism. They want it for pilgrimage. But as far as other suggestion goes, it was from the perspective I made that our peripheries, we can in due course of time we can visualize it at the new core. Periphery does not need to be periphery forever. It can be a gateway to our neighbors and even beyond. Thank you.
I feel very grateful for the professor's valuable comments and suggestions. and for my further improvement and revision. And for this paper, I think that some of the most necessary one is the title. The object needs to be redefined, and maybe their attitudes needs to be narrowed down. And here in my paper, the Chinese attitude does not include those from Hong Kong or Macau. And some of my contents and structures of the paper needs to be reorganized, and more aspects to be integrated into the paper to make it more complete. Thank you.
Thank you, Suying. I think with that we conclude the first session. A big thanks to all the four presenters and all the discussants, and the Q&A participation from the audience. May I now invite everyone to lunch? Yes, that's true. Thanks.